"Play Beethoven tonight, and I'll marry you," said the saloon singer. Then the rancher broke her. The town of Red Creek was small, dusty, and loud in the evenings. During the day, it looked almost forgotten. Wind pushed dry sand across the main road, wooden signs creaked above shop doors, and horses stood tied outside the general store. But when the sun went down, the town came alive. Lanterns glowed along the boardwalk. Laughter spilled into the streets, and the Silver Spur Saloon became the heart of everything. Inside the Silver Spur, the air always carried the smell of wood, smoke, and strong coffee. Boots tapped against the wooden floor, cards shuffled at the tables, and cowboys told stories that grew bigger with every telling. But no matter how loud the room became, it always fell silent when Clara Whitmore stepped onto the small stage near the back wall. Clara was not from Red Creek originally. She had arrived 3 years earlier with nothing but a small suitcase and a worn music book tucked inside. No one knew much about her past, and she did not offer many details. What people did know was this. When she sang, something changed in the room. Conversation stopped. Arguments paused. Even the roughest ranch hands listened with quiet respect. She had chestnut brown hair that she pinned neatly at the back of her head, and eyes that carried both kindness and a quiet sadness. She wore simple dresses, nothing flashy, but she carried herself with a calm confidence. The old upright piano on stage was scratched and slightly out of tune, yet under her fingers it seemed to wake up. Most nights she sang familiar songs, tunes people could hum along to. Some were cheerful and playful. Others were slow and thoughtful. She knew how to read the room. If the men were tired from long days under the sun, she chose something gentle. If they were celebrating a good cattle sale, she picked something lively. Music was her way of speaking without saying too much. On a certain Thursday evening, a storm gathered outside the town. Dark clouds rolled across the sky and thunder echoed in the distance. The wind pushed open the saloon doors more than once before someone finally tied them back. Rain was rare in Red Creek, and when it came, it felt dramatic. Inside, the saloon was fuller than usual. Travelers who had been passing through decided to stay the night rather than ride in the storm. The tables were crowded, and the noise was louder than normal. Clara stood behind the curtain near the stage, listening to the storm and to the rising chatter of the crowd. "Big night," said Martha, the saloon owner, as she handed Clara a warm cup of tea. Martha was a strong woman in her 50s who had run the Silver Spur for over 20 years. She trusted Clara and treated her almost like family. "Storms make people restless," Clara replied softly, taking a sip. "I'll start with something calm." Martha smiled. "They'll quiet down once you begin." The room slowly noticed her. One by one, voices lowered. She sat at the piano, adjusted the small lantern beside it, and pressed her fingers gently against the keys. The first notes floated into the air, soft and steady. It was a simple melody, something familiar. The sound mixed with the rain tapping against the windows. Gradually, the room settled. Even the storm seemed to grow distant. Halfway through her second song, the saloon doors opened again. A tall man stepped inside, brushing rain from his coat. He paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room. He did not rush to the counter or call for a drink. Instead, he removed his hat and stood still, listening. His name was Daniel Hayes. Word had already spread around town about him. He had recently purchased a large piece of land just beyond Red Creek. Some said he had inherited money. Others said he had built his ranch from nothing. No one seemed to know the full story. What people agreed on was that he kept to himself. Daniel was not dressed like the typical ranch hands who filled the saloon. His boots were polished, his coat well fitted. His expression was serious but not unfriendly. He carried himself like someone used to responsibility. He noticed the music first. Clara did not see him at once. Her attention was on the piano, on keeping the rhythm steady. But as she finished her song and looked up, her eyes briefly met his. It was not a long glance, but it was enough to notice something different. He was not clapping loudly like the others. He was simply watching. She began another song, one with a brighter tone. A few men tapped their glasses in rhythm. Laughter returned, though softer now. Daniel moved to a corner table, still silent. After nearly an hour, Clara reached her final performance of the night. The storm outside had grown stronger, and lightning flashed against the windows. She decided to end with a slow ballad, her voice carrying clearly above the wind. When the last note faded, applause filled the room. Some men stood. Others called her name. Clara smiled politely and gave a small nod. She stood from the piano bench, ready to step away. But before she could leave the stage, a calm voice spoke from the corner. "Would you play something else?" It was Daniel. Clara tilted her head slightly. Requests were common, but something about his tone felt steady, almost formal. "What would you like to hear?" she asked. He stood from his chair, removing his gloves slowly. Beethoven. For a moment the room was silent, then laughter burst out. Beethoven? One man repeated between laughs. In the Silver Spur? That's Fancy City music, another called out. Clara smiled faintly, though surprise flickered in her eyes. Beethoven was not the kind of music usually played in Red Creek. The old piano had never carried such melodies here. She studied Daniel more carefully now. His face remained serious. He was not joking. You might be in the wrong place for that, Clara said gently. I don't think so, Daniel replied. Music belongs wherever it's played. The laughter softened. Something in his confidence quieted the teasing. Clara rested her hands lightly on the piano. That's a difficult piece to play on this instrument, she said. I understand. His answer was simple. For a second, Clara felt a spark of challenge rise inside her. She had trained in classical music when she was younger. Long before Red Creek. Long before the Silver Spur. Beethoven was not unfamiliar to her fingers, narrate. But it had been years. She looked around at the rough wooden walls, the lantern light, the muddy boots. Beethoven did not seem to fit here, yet neither had she when she first arrived. A playful smile curved at the corner of her lips. Play Beethoven tonight, she said lightly, and I'll marry you. Glasses lifted. Someone clapped loudly at the boldness of her words. It was meant as a joke, a clever way to answer a bold request. But Daniel did not laugh. He held her gaze steadily. The laughter slowly faded as people noticed his expression. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. She had expected him to grin, to bow dramatically, to let the moment pass. Instead, he gave a small nod. Very well, he said quietly. The storm outside roared again, as if marking the moment. Clara turned back to the piano, suddenly aware that the room was watching more closely than before. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a brief second, doubt crept in. The piano was worn, the keys slightly uneven. The sound imperfect, but she began. The opening notes were soft, almost fragile. They drifted into the smoky air, different from anything usually heard in the saloon. Conversation stopped entirely. Even those who did not recognize the piece felt the shift in atmosphere. The melody grew stronger, filling the room with emotion that did not need explanation. It was not perfect. The piano resisted in places, but Clara's hands moved with quiet determination. Daniel stood still, listening as if the world outside the music had disappeared. And for the first time that night, Red Creek felt like more than a dusty town in the middle of nowhere. It felt like the beginning of something no one yet understood. By sunrise, the story had already traveled from the bakery to the blacksmith shop. Men who had been at the Silver Spur the night before repeated every detail with wide gestures and dramatic voices. She really said she'd marry him, and he didn't laugh. And that music? I've never heard anything like it. Others tried to hum the melody, though none of them truly remembered it. What they did remember was the feeling. For a few minutes, the Silver Spur had not been a noisy saloon. It had felt grand and quiet, like something from another world. Clara heard the whispers before she even stepped outside her small rented room above the dressmaker's shop. She had barely slept. The moment replayed in her mind again and again. The request, her teasing reply, and Daniel's steady voice saying, "Very well." She had not expected him to return. Men made bold gestures in saloons all the time. They made promises they never intended to keep. They spoke loudly, laughed, and disappeared by morning. But something about Daniel Hayes felt different. Clara tied her hair back neatly and looked at her reflection in the small mirror hanging beside the window. It was just a joke, she whispered to herself. Nothing more. Still, her heart felt unsettled. Later that afternoon, Martha called her down to the saloon earlier than usual. You should hear what people are saying, Martha said, wiping down a table with quick, strong movements. Half the town thinks there'll be a wedding by next month. Clara shook her head, smiling faintly. There won't be. You so sure? It was playful, Clara replied. He'll forget by tonight. But Martha did not look convinced. Evening came slowly, and with it the familiar glow of lanterns inside the Silver Spur. The wooden floorboards had dried from the storm. The air smelled fresher than usual. Clara took her place behind the curtain again. Listening to the rising noise of the crowd, she noticed something different in the energy of the room. People were watching the door. Waiting. When the saloon doors finally opened, a hush passed through the crowd before anyone even realized it. Daniel Hayes stepped inside. This time, he was not wearing a rain-soaked coat. He looked composed and prepared. In one hand he carried a small leather folder. He did not look around nervously. He did not seem unsure. He walked calmly toward a table near the front of the stage and sat down. The room buzzed with whispers. He came back. I told you he would. Clara felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She had expected embarrassment. Instead, she felt something else. Curiosity. Martha leaned close to her and whispered, "Looks like he remembers." Clara took a steady breath and stepped onto the stage. Applause greeted her, louder than usual. Some men grinned knowingly. Others elbowed each other, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara sat at the piano but did not begin playing right away. Her eyes found Daniel in the crowd. He stood. The entire saloon grew quiet. Without rushing, he walked toward the stage. The leather folder remained in his hand. "I believe you made a promise," he said calmly. A few people chuckled nervously, unsure if they should laugh again. Clara tilted her head slightly, maintaining her composure. "And I believe you asked for Beethoven." Daniel opened the leather folder and carefully removed several sheets of music. The pages were slightly aged but neatly kept. "My mother taught me to play when I was a boy," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "She loved Beethoven more than any other composer. When she passed, this is what I kept." His voice was steady, but there was softness behind it. The laughter in the room faded completely. He stepped closer to the piano and placed the sheet music gently on its stand. "I cannot play it well myself," he admitted, "but I hoped you might." What had begun as a playful challenge was no longer a joke. It carried meaning. Clara looked down at the pages. She recognized the piece immediately. It was more complex than what she had played the night before. It would demand focus, strength, and patience. She glanced at Daniel again. "You planned this," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied simply. "Why?" "Because some things deserve to be taken seriously." Those words settled deep inside her. Clara had spent years in Red Creek being admired, but not always respected. Men praised her voice, her beauty, her charm, but few looked beyond the stage. Few asked about her past, her training, her dreams. Daniel was not staring at her like a performer. He was looking at her like a musician. Slowly, she adjusted the sheets of music. The piano keys felt slightly colder beneath her fingers tonight. The first notes began softer than the night before. The melody was slower, richer. It did not rush to impress. It unfolded carefully, like a story told with patience. Every person in the saloon listened. Even those who did not understand classical music could sense the depth in it. It was not loud or flashy. It was thoughtful. Daniel remained standing beside the stage, his hat held respectfully in his hands. His eyes were closed for part of the piece, as if remembering something far away. Clara felt something shift inside her as she played. The silver spur disappeared again. The dusty town faded. For a few moments, she was no longer a saloon singer playing for tips and applause. She was the girl she once had been, practicing for hours in a quiet room, dreaming of concert halls and polished stages. The final section of the piece required strength. The old piano resisted slightly, but Clara pressed on, her fingers moving with determination. When the last note echoed and faded, silence filled the room. Not a restless silence, a respectful one. Then applause rose slowly, building until it filled every corner of the saloon. Some men stood, others removed their hats. Clara's chest rose and fell as she caught her breath. Daniel opened his eyes. He stepped forward again, calm but certain. "I kept my part," he said. The room held its breath. Clara felt dozens of eyes on her. Her playful words from the night before now carried weight. She could laugh it off again. She could say it was a joke. She could turn the moment light. Instead, she surprised herself. She stood from the piano bench and faced him directly. "You did," she said softly. The crowd waited. Daniel did not kneel. He did not create a dramatic scene. He simply extended his hand toward her, not demanding, not forcing, an invitation. Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. She searched for arrogance or pride, but she saw none. There was only sincerity. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly, so only he could hear. "I do not make promises lightly," he replied. Her heart beat faster. This was no longer about a joke in a saloon. It was about stepping into a life she did not fully understand. Yet something in Daniel's steadiness made her feel safe. Slowly she placed her hand in his. The saloon erupted with cheers. Martha wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. Moonlight spilled through the windows, lighting the room with a soft glow. No official wedding was planned that night. No papers were signed. But in that small town, a promise made in front of witnesses meant something. Over the next weeks, Daniel visited the saloon less as a customer and more as a quiet companion. He did not boast about winning a challenge. He did not act as if Clara were a prize. Instead, he listened when she spoke. He asked about her training, her childhood, the teachers who had guided her. He told her about his ranch, the long mornings, the responsibility of caring for workers and land. They walked along the edge of town some evenings, speaking about simple things, weather, books, music. To many in Red Creek, it felt like a fairy tale born from a bold request. But beneath the surface, something deeper was forming. Clara had always belonged to the stage. Daniel belonged to open fields and quiet land. Neither yet understood how different those worlds truly were. For now, though, the town celebrated. The story of Beethoven and the Silver Spur became legend. Children repeated it in playful voices. Travelers carried it to nearby towns. And Clara, who once thought her words were nothing more than a teasing reply, realized that some promises, even those spoken lightly, have the power to change everything. The wedding was simple, quiet, and witnessed by nearly the entire town of Red Creek. It took place on a clear morning just outside the small church near the edge of Main Street. The sky was pale blue, and the air carried the smell of dry grass and fresh bread from the bakery nearby. Clara wore a modest cream-colored dress that Martha had helped stitch by hand. It was not fancy, but it suited her. Daniel stood beside her in a dark suit, looking steady and proud. When they exchanged vows, there were no grand speeches, just simple promises spoken in calm voices. Many people smiled and whispered about how romantic it all was, the saloon singer and the quiet rancher, a challenge that turned into marriage. It sounded like a story meant to be told for years, but stories often end at the wedding. Real life does not. After the celebration, Clara packed her few belongings from her small rented room. The piano at the Silver Spur remained where it had always been. She ran her fingers across its surface one last time before leaving. "You can always visit," Martha said, giving her a tight hug. "I know," Clara replied softly. She climbed into the wagon beside Daniel, and together they began the journey to his ranch several miles outside of town. The ranch was larger than Clara had imagined. Wide fields stretched in every direction. Fences lined the property, and a sturdy wooden house stood at the center. There was no noise of crowds, no lantern-lit stage, no music drifting through the air, only wind. The first few weeks felt peaceful. Clara woke early with Daniel, watching the sunrise over the fields. She helped in small ways around the house, cooking, cleaning, organizing supplies. The workers greeted her respectfully. Some tipped their hats shyly, unsure how to speak to the former saloon singer who was now the rancher's wife. Daniel seemed pleased. Well, he showed her the barns, the horses, the grazing land. He explained how he managed the workers and kept the ranch running smoothly. Clara listened carefully, wanting to understand his world. In the evenings, they sat on the porch as the sky turned orange and then deep blue. For a while, it felt like a calm and gentle life. But silence has a way of growing louder when someone is used to music. One afternoon, while Daniel was out inspecting the far fields, Clara explored the house more carefully. In a back room covered with a sheet stood a small, upright piano. Her heart skipped. She slowly pulled the sheet away. Dust rose into the air. The piano was old but in better condition than the one at the Silver Spur. She pressed one key gently. The sound was clear, though slightly stiff from disuse. Daniel had not mentioned it. She sat down cautiously and began to play a simple melody. Nothing loud, just something soft to fill the quiet room. For the first time since leaving town, she felt like herself again. When Daniel returned that evening, he paused in the doorway when he heard the music. Clara looked up, smiling. "You never told me there was a piano." "It belonged to my mother," he said after a moment. His voice was calm, but there was something guarded in it. "It's beautiful," Clara said. "May I play it?" He hesitated only briefly. "Of course." But after that evening, something shifted. Daniel began coming home earlier whenever she played. He would sit nearby, listening, but not with the same expression he had worn in the saloon. There was no distant memory in his eyes now. Instead, there was thoughtfulness, calculation. One night during supper, he spoke carefully. "The men in town still talk," he said. "About what?" Clara asked. "About you. About the Silver Spur." "I expected they might." Daniel nodded. "A rancher's wife carries a certain image." "And what image is that?" "Respectable. Quiet. Focused on the home." She set her fork down completely. "Was I not respectable before?" He quickly shook his head. "That's not what I mean." In the days that followed, Daniel began suggesting small changes. "You don't need to go into town as often," he said gently. "The workers notice when you play loudly," he mentioned another evening. "It's better if we keep things private." He never raised his voice. He never demanded harshly. Instead, his request came wrapped in reason. She knew reputation mattered in small communities. She knew Daniel had worked hard to build his ranch. She did not want to create difficulty for him. So she adjusted. She played more softly. She visited town less frequently. She stopped performing at the Silver Spur altogether, even when Martha sent word inviting her for special occasions. "I'm married now," she told herself. Life changes. But each time she closed the piano lid without finishing a melody, a small piece of her felt closed as well. The workers on the ranch treated her kindly, yet there was distance. They saw her as the rancher's wife first, not as Clara the musician. Conversations with Daniel grew shorter, more practical. How many cattle were moved today? Will the fence repairs be done before winter? The evenings on the porch became quieter. One afternoon, Clara found her old music book packed inside a drawer. She flipped through the pages slowly, remembering long hours of practice before she had ever stepped into the Silver Spur. She had once dreamed of performing in grand halls. Life had led her somewhere else, and she had accepted it. The saloon had not been perfect, but it had allowed her voice to exist. Now even that felt distant. When she played Beethoven again one evening, Daniel entered the room halfway through the piece. He listened until she finished. "That music," he said slowly, "brings attention. It's only us here." "Not always," he replied. "Sound carries." She closed the piano gently. "Do you wish me to stop?" Daniel paused. "I wish for peace," he answered. She nodded, though something inside her tightened. From that night on, the piano remained closed more often than open. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, the early mornings, the endless chores, the careful planning for seasons ahead. She performed her duties well. No one could say she was not devoted, but devotion without joy feels heavy. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Clara stood alone near the fence line. Wind moved through the tall grass. The land was beautiful, wide, and free. Yet she felt smaller within it. She remembered the night of the storm, the laughter, the challenge, the way Beethoven's melody had filled the Silver Spur and transformed it. Daniel had fallen in love with the woman who brought music into rough spaces. Now he seemed uncomfortable with that same music. He believed he was shaping a stable future, protecting his name, guarding their reputation. He did not see that in asking her to quiet herself. He was slowly dimming the very light that had drawn him to her. Clara did not argue loudly. She did not rebel dramatically. Instead, she adjusted again, and each adjustment felt like folding a piece of herself away, carefully, quietly, until she began to wonder how much of her remained unfolded at all. Cold winds swept across the open fields of the ranch, bending the tall grass and rattling the wooden shutters of the house. The mornings grew sharp and pale, and frost covered the fence posts like a thin layer of glass. Inside the house, the rooms felt larger than before, as if the silence had expanded with the cold. Clara had grown used to the quiet, but she had not grown comfortable in it. Her days were full of work. She rose before sunrise, prepared breakfast for Daniel and the ranch hands, and kept the house in careful order. She learned how to manage supplies, how to track expenses in a small ledger, and how to prepare for the long winter months. Anyone watching from the outside would say she'd become exactly what a rancher's wife should be. But there were moments, small, sharp moments, when she would pause in the middle of a task and feel something missing. The piano in the back room remained closed. Sometimes she would pass by it and lightly brush her fingers over its wooden lid, but she rarely opened it anymore. Not because Daniel had strictly forbidden it, he had not, but his quiet disapproval lingered in the air whenever she played. It was not loud, not angry, just heavy. One afternoon, as snow threatened to fall, a traveling merchant arrived at the ranch. He came twice a year to sell supplies and deliver letters from nearby towns. His wagon creaked under the weight of goods, and his coat was dusted with early flakes of snow. Daniel welcomed him politely and invited him inside for warm coffee. Clara joined them at the table, listening as they discussed cattle prices and weather forecasts. The merchant was cheerful, talkative, and full of news. "Red Creek's busier than ever," he said with a grin. "The Silver Spur hired a new singer last month. Young fellow. Out voice. Not as refined as some might like, but the crowd enjoys him." Clara kept her expression calm, though her heart tightened slightly. "Oh?" Daniel replied, neutral. Yes, the merchant continued, though I must say, people still speak of the night that beautiful lady played Beethoven in that saloon. I've heard the story in 3 different towns now. He laughed warmly, unaware of the effect his words carried. Clara lowered her eyes to her cup. Daniel said nothing. After the merchant left, the house felt even quieter than before. That evening, Daniel worked late in the barn, checking on the animals before the storm arrived. Clara remained inside alone. The wind grew stronger, pressing against the walls. Snow began to fall steadily, covering the land in white. The world outside seemed to disappear under the storm. Clara stood in the doorway of the back room for a long moment, staring at the piano. Her reflection stared back at her in the small mirror above it, a woman who looked calm, composed, responsible, but her eyes told another story. Slowly, she walked forward and lifted the lid. The keys felt cold beneath her fingers. Well, she sat down and let her hands rest there without moving. For a few seconds, she simply listened to the wind outside. Then she began to play. Soft at first, almost hesitant. The melody of Beethoven returned, not bold and dramatic like that night in the saloon, but gentle and filled with longing. Each note seemed to carry unspoken thoughts. The music flowed through the quiet house, blending with the sound of the storm. As she played, memories rose clearly in her mind. The lantern light of the silver spur, the way the room had fallen silent, the look in Daniel's eyes when he had first heard her. She realized something painful. The man who had stood in that saloon had loved her music. The man who now stood in the barn seemed afraid of it. Her fingers pressed harder against the keys, emotion rising through the melody. The piece grew stronger, fuller, echoing through the empty rooms. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel had returned and was standing just outside the doorway. He did not enter immediately. He listened. At first, he simply heard music. But as the melody deepened, he began to hear something else. Sadness, not loud sorrow, not anger, just quiet grief. He stepped into the doorway. Clara did not notice him until the final notes faded. When she turned and saw him there, she froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You've not played like that in a long time," Daniel said softly. She swallowed. "There hasn't been much reason to." The words hung between them. Daniel stepped closer, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "The merchant spoke carelessly today. He spoke truth," Clara replied gently. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I don't want you to think I'm ashamed of you." She looked at him steadily. "Are you?" Then he hesitated. "I only want a life that is steady, respected." "And my music threatens that?" she asked. He struggled to explain. "People talk. They remember the saloon, the crowds, the laughter. I worked hard to build something solid here. I don't want whispers to follow us." Clara stood slowly from the piano bench. "Daniel," she said calmly, "when you asked me to play Beethoven, you didn't ask the saloon singer. You asked the musician." He remained silent. "That music is not noise," she continued. "It is part of who I am. When I stop playing, I don't become more respectable, I become less myself." Her voice was steady, not raised. That steadiness made her words stronger. Daniel looked around the room, at the piano, at the closed windows, at the quiet walls. "I thought giving you this home would be enough," he said. "It is a good home," she replied, "but it cannot replace my voice." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and confusion mixing in his expression. "I never meant to silence you." "But you did," she said gently. The honesty in her tone was not cruel. It was clear. Snow continued falling outside, covering the fields in white silence. Daniel remembered the first night he had heard her play. The way the music had filled the room was something greater than noise. The pride he had felt walking beside her after that. Somewhere along the way, fear had replaced that pride. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing control. Fear of not being taken seriously. And, without realizing it, he had tried to reshape the very woman he admired. Clara walked toward the window and looked out at the storm. "I kept my promise," she said quietly. "I became your wife. I left the stage. I changed my world." Daniel's chest felt heavy, "But I lost something in the process," she added. He stepped closer. "What did you lose?" She turned to face him, her eyes calm but shining with emotion. "Myself." It was simple, and it struck deeper than anger ever could. Daniel looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time since their wedding day, not as a rancher's wife, not as a reputation to protect, but as Clara. The woman who could turn a rough saloon into something beautiful with nothing but worn piano keys. The storm outside began to soften, the wind slowing. Inside the house, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt honest. For the first time, Daniel understood that love built on admiration cannot survive if admiration turns into control, and Clara understood that staying silent would only continue the slow breaking she had been feeling for months. Neither of them knew yet what the morning would bring, but they both knew something had to change. When morning light touched the ranch, everything looked different. Snow covered the wide fields in soft white, smoothing over fences and wagon tracks. The world seemed quiet, almost peaceful, as if it had been given a chance to begin again. Inside the house, Clara was already awake. She had not slept much. Her conversation with Daniel from the night before stayed in her thoughts. The words she had spoken, myself, still echoed in her heart. She stood near the kitchen window, watching the sun slowly rise over the frozen land. The ranch was beautiful in winter, calm, strong, steady. But beauty without joy felt incomplete. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Daniel entered the room quietly. He looked tired, but not angry. His expression carried something new. Reflection. They stood in silence for a moment. "The snow is deep," he said softly. "Yes," Clara replied. "It makes everything look untouched." "Clara, about last night." She turned to face him, her posture calm but firm. "I heard you," he continued. "Truly heard you." She waited. "I thought I was protecting our life," he said. "I believed that if everything looked proper, if no one had reason to whisper, then we would be strong." Clara's voice remained gentle. "And did it make us strong?" "No," he admitted at last. The word felt heavy, but honest. Daniel moved closer to the table and rested his hands on its surface. "When I first heard you play, it changed something in me. I felt proud standing beside you. I felt inspired." "Clara!" Listened carefully. "Somewhere along the way," he continued, "I became afraid that others would not see you the way I did, that they would reduce you to gossip instead of talent." "And so you reduced me first?" she said quietly. He winced slightly at the truth in her words. "I didn't mean to," he replied. "But intention does not erase impact." Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer cold. It felt open. Clara stepped toward the back room where the piano stood. Daniel followed her slowly. She rested her hand on the instrument but did not open it. "I do not want to leave this ranch in anger," she said. "I do not want to tear down what we built." Daniel's heart tightened. "Are you leaving?" "I am choosing not to disappear." He understood. "You cannot ask a bird to stop flying and still expect it to sing," she added softly. The words were simple yet clear. Daniel looked at the piano, then at her. "What would you have me do?" It was the first time he had asked instead of suggested. Clara took a slow breath. "Let me play. Let me visit town without shame. Let people speak if they wish. Respect built on fear is not respect at all. And if I wish to teach children music someday," she continued, "or perform again in a way that feels right to me, I need to know you will stand beside me, not behind me, watching." "I cannot promise I will never worry," he said honestly, "but I can promise I will not silence you again." She studied his face carefully, searching for certainty. This was not a dramatic apology. It was not loud, but it was real. She opened the piano lid. Morning light fell across the keys. "Then listen," she said softly. She began to play. This time the melody was not filled with longing or sadness. It carried strength, not loud or proud, but steady. Each note felt grounded, like the land outside the window. Daniel did not stand in the doorway this time. He pulled a chair beside the piano and sat. He listened without calculation, without fear. Outside, ranch hands moved through the snow, preparing for the day. The sound of music drifted faintly through the house, carried gently by the cold air. For the first time since their wedding, Clara did not lower her volume when she noticed others nearby, and Daniel did not ask her to. The days that followed were not magically perfect. Change rarely happens overnight. There were still moments of adjustment, moments of old habits trying to return, but something important had shifted. Clara began visiting Red Creek once a week, not to return to late-night saloon performances, but to meet with Martha and speak about offering music lessons in the back room of the Silver Spur during the daytime. Children came first out of curiosity. Then they came out of excitement. Clara taught them simple melodies, posture, rhythm. She showed them that music was not just entertainment, it was expression. The town slowly began to see her differently. Not only as the former saloon singer, not only as the rancher's wife, but as a teacher. A musician. A woman of skill. Daniel visited town with her sometimes. He did not stand apart. He did not look uncomfortable. When people mentioned the famous night of Beethoven, he smiled quietly instead of tightening his jaw. He realized something important. Reputation built on truth is stronger than reputation built on silence. Months later, during spring, Clara organized a small recital in town. It was held in the church hall rather than the saloon. Lanterns lit the space warmly. Families gathered to watch their children play the pieces they had practiced. Daniel sat in the front row. When Clara stepped forward to play at the end of the evening, the room grew still. She chose Beethoven again, not because of a challenge, but because she wanted to. As her fingers moved across the keys, the melody filled the hall with confidence and grace. It carried no sadness this time, no regret, only truth. Daniel felt pride rise in his chest, not the fragile pride that fears whispers, but the kind that stands firm regardless of them. When the final note faded, applause filled the room. Clara looked toward Daniel, and their eyes met. There was no unspoken tension now, no quiet resentment, only understanding. Later that night, as they returned to the ranch under a sky full of stars, Daniel spoke softly. "I almost broke the very thing I admired most," he admitted. Clara reached for his hand, and I almost let myself disappear, trying to keep peace. They walked in thoughtful silence for a few steps. "Love is not meant to shrink someone," Daniel said. "No," Clara replied. "It is meant to make space." The ranch remained steady. The fields still stretched wide and strong, but now music lived there too. On quiet evenings, the sound of piano drifted from the house across the land. Workers sometimes paused to listen. Some even smiled. The story of the stormy night in the Silver Spur continued to travel from town to town. People told it as a romantic tale, the singer who joked about marriage and the rancher who took her seriously. But those who knew the full truth understood something deeper. This time neither of them had to break to keep it.